Hey everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film, Atlanta's LGBTQ Film Festival. And we've been doing a lot of in conversation with events the last 3 years with filmmakers across the world. It's something we really enjoy, and our patrons enjoy it as well. I am so happy today to be talking to filmmaker and podcast creator Dave Quantic. Dave is very prolific. Dave had a couple of short films in our festival last year. Dave, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
Well, I was doing my research this morning, and there's just so much to talk about. But just give us a Dave Quantic cliff notes. Just tell us a little bit about your career and how you got into the industry.
Yeah, well, I started my filmmaking career in 1999 when I went to graduate film school at UCLA and moved to LA and graduated in 2004. And ever since then, I have been working in the industry in various kinds of jobs, mostly documentary, and either assisting people create documentaries or doing my own thing. And in 2016, I moved to Seattle because I needed a little change of pace. I wanted to sort of refocus my own priorities on my own work. And ever since then, it's been a mixture of working on my own things and then also, jobs for work. It turns out there's not a lot of money to be made in creating queer film, but I still love it, and I will always do it.
Would you say that all of your projects are queer films, queer related films?
Yeah, all the ones that I create myself are queer. And most of the stuff I work on for other people as well. Although right now I have a full-time job as a video editor for a news site up here in the Pacific Northwest called Crosssection. And I edit their video content that is also shown on the local PBS affiliate. So most of the work I do for my job right now is for broadcast on PBS.
Oh, great. Okay. So you had two short films in our festival last year. You had Four Fruit Bites, which was in our festival, and Stephen and James, Best Girlfriends. And I have to tell you that, we like both of those a lot, but we still get people who talk about Stephen and James and how funny it was. And if you haven't seen it, there's a very funny Danish story in there, but so congratulations on those. And those had a pretty healthy festival run last year.
Yeah, it's still going on. I'm about to go to LA next weekend for the Outfest Fusion Festival. And they just played in Australia. And there's another one coming up that I can't remember offhand, but they've had quite a life, quite a run. It's been fun.
Congratulations. What are some other films that you've worked on over the years?
Oh gosh, I've made over 20 queer shorts over the last 20 years. Some of them were narrative. I came out of film school thinking I was going to be a narrative filmmaker, writer, director. And, I did try my best to do that. Things just didn't pan out. I think that my tastes were a little not mainstream enough. So I have sort of turned full-time to documentary, which I love. But I've made a lot of both kinds of films. I've also made some experimental films too. So it's a mixed bag.
I feel so sad. I did not know this until this morning, but Jeffrey Schwartz is one of our favorite directors. We've shown, I think, pretty much all of his films. He just makes such extraordinarily amazing documentaries, but you were involved with a veto. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, Jeffrey was one of the first professional friends that I made in the industry when I was in graduate film school. We had some friends in common, and he's become like a mentor to me, and I really value his opinion on my work, and I go to him for a lot of questions I have about my career, and also he's just a good friend. But yeah, when he was making Vito, I was his main cinematographer for most of the interviews that we shot. We got to meet, Larry Kramer and Armistead Maupin, some of my personal heroes, which was just amazing. I learned a lot from him on that job in how deeply prepared he is for each interview. He's an amazing sort of conductor when it comes to being prepared for an interview. Yeah.
Vito was an extraordinary documentary. We showed it the year it came out. For those who don't know, it was about the life of Vito Russo, who's an activist. I mean, what are some things that you specifically learned from Jeffrey during that time, as you know, he was making the documentary?
Well, certainly about how prepared he is. You know, he would have a binder with all of the questions he was going to ask, and then also each person would have their own sort of section, and he would know exactly what kind of questions he would ask each person. And I've definitely become that obsessive when it comes to coming to an interview and being prepared. And then also just how personable he is. He's very intent on making sure that the interviewee feels secure and comfortable, and he doesn't rush people or make them do a lot of legwork when it comes to thinking about how what they're saying is going to be cut later. You know, he's very good at making people feel relaxed, and I definitely try to do that with my own work, and creating an atmosphere of comfort and support for the interviewee.
That's great. Vito had an amazing festival run that year, but it also went on to win an Emmy. So congratulations for that.
Yeah, this is amazing.
Yeah. So I also did not know this either. I did a lot of, you know, found out a lot of things about you, that you used to work with the Seattle Core Festival.
Yeah, you know, when I decided to move to Seattle, my friend Jason Plord was running the festival at the time, and I served as the print traffic coordinator in 2016. And, you know, before that, even before moving here, I have created their trailers in 2007, 2014, and then also one a few years ago. So I've enjoyed making promotional films for them. I also did a series called Shoutouts that were interviews with supporters and members of their organization to sort of help promote the organization. Also, I've worked on their Real Queer Youth program in the summers, and it just happens to be because of doing that volunteer work that I made a connection with a person who got me my current job. Nice. So like it was because of that connection that I think I was able to kind of rise above the rest of the crowd during my interview process. So, you know, working in queer film can be transformational when it comes to wanting to move to a different city or wanting to get a job. You know, there's a lot of things that can happen as a result of that can really transform your life. And I mean, when I was living in LA, I volunteered for Outfest a couple of years when I first moved there, and some of the people that I met that summer have become lifelong friends. So, you know, queer film and the queer filmmaking community is one that has been so supportive of me, and it's really enriched my life, and I feel very lucky that I've been able to kind of thrive while also making queer film too, because like I said, you don't make a lot of money making queer film, but it is very satisfying.
But having said it, there's a lot of money to be made in queer film festivals. That's where all the millionaires work, you know, like
yeah,
being a little sarcastic there, but you know, but just obviously, you know, you're a filmmaker, but you've also you know, created podcasts. Can you sort of talk about, you know, morphing into that and how that came about and how that has worked out for you?
Yeah, you know, it's not something I ever thought that I would do, become a podcaster. But in 2018, I decided to make a short film for the Hump Film Festival, which was started here in Seattle by Dan Savage, who does the Savage Love podcast, and he's a sex advice writer. And, you know, his film festival Hump is one that is encouraging of all different types of bodies and people. And to make 5-minute pornographic film that's very, you know, affirming. And instead of making a traditional porn, I decided to make a documentary. And in order to sort of explore what my theme might be, I decided to interview 18 friends of mine about their coming of age years and about how they discovered their sexual identities and preferences. And I ended up making a short called Porn Yesterday,
okay,
which got into Hump, and it won the jury award that year. And it could only be 5 minutes long, though. So I had all this amazing extra content just laying on the editing room floor. So what I decided to do was turn each of those interviews into a different podcast episode that just featured one person's sort of coming of age story. And their also different details about their sex lives and what they've learned along the way, you know. And so all of those people composed the first season of the podcast, and it ended up turning out really good. I was really happy with it. It was a very like artistically satisfying experiment, because, like, you know, with film, you work so hard on something and nobody ever sees it until maybe it might get into a festival that you could maybe go to and like sit in the audience, you know. And with podcasting, you do kind of, every episode you release, you get kind of a rush, you know, because you're releasing something out into the world, and you do get responses from people and such. So after that first season, I was like, well, why don't I just keep going?
Yeah.
So I actually increased the number of questions that I asked, and I continued to interview people, and I really tried. I have been trying very hard to get a more diverse cross-section of queer people to interview. And I'm currently just in the beginning of my 4th season. And to date, I think I've released about 45 unique episodes that feature a different queer person for each of them. And my goal is to do at least 100. Interviews, like releasing them via the podcast. You know, I could keep on going and going. What I'd like to do is to eventually be able to support myself just with the podcast. So lately I have been trying to get more sponsorships and donors via Patreon. But it's very satisfying. I love providing queer people a platform where they can kind of describe their life and what all they've learned along the way in terms of learning sex, you know, because as queer people, you know, most of us are raised by hetero people who have no clue about queer sex. And even if we were straight, our parents probably wouldn't want to talk about sex with us either. You know, I ask, one of my questions is, you know, did your parents have the talk with you? And I would say 90% of the time the answer is no. You know, so a lot of queer people learn about sex through pornography, or, you know, maybe they have an encounter with somebody who is not the most patient or kind person, you know. So there's a lot of learning to be done when you are coming of age as a queer person and exploring your sexuality. And I like that I'm kind of providing a resource. And, you know, it's also entertaining too. People have some really, really funny stories.
I can imagine. I'd like to hear some of this. The podcast is called Fruitbowl. And actually, one of the short films that you submitted us last year for Fruit Bites was taken from some of those. I mean, how did you sort of pull those together for that short film?
Yeah, well, actually, Stephen and James is also based on an interview from Fruitbowl too. I'm, you know, for every interview of Fruitbowl, I film people in their bedrooms on their bed with 4K video. So it's a little different format than most podcasts, because I feature the interviewee in a near monologue. They're pretty much, it's only just them speaking for the entire episode. And because I film the interviews, I am able to make short films from them. you'll notice in Stephen and James that Stephen never appears on camera. That's because he requested an interview only, or a audio only interview. His work would not be okay with him being on camera and talking about sex.
Okay.
But the other people in 4 Fruit Bites are on camera, and those are more typical of what I think the interviews look like and what the eventual documentary will look like. But the goal is to either make a feature documentary or a docu-series for TV, for like a streaming platform that goes into the different aspects of queer coming of age. You know, I imagine that the TV show would have different themes for the different episodes, like family, first times, you know, most awkward hookups, you know, stuff like that, where we kind of lead viewers through a kind of a coming of age process.
Do you find that it's difficult for a lot of queer people to talk about sex?
Yes. But like I said, it's difficult for everyone to talk about sex. It's not something that we are taught, gay or straight, as adolescents. And more often now, schools are just pulling out of the sex education business. They're not interested, or they only teach abstinence. You know, I'd say that the baseline people get is that moment in 5th grade where you're split into boys and girls and you're each given the different talks, you know, in a very clinical and you know, medical way. They don't describe any of the kind of social issues surrounding sex. So yeah, definitely. I mean, we are not taught to talk about sex, but I have found that, like, when you give queer people the platform and they know how their interview is going to be produced and released to the public, I feel like because I really include them in that process, they're much more comfortable in sharing their stories. And especially because, like, I also provide them a platform to describe how they grew up, what their community was like, what their family arrangement was like, what their family's feelings were about them being queer. You know, that it's not just about sex. I kind of use sex as an entry point for a larger discussion about what it's like to be raised as a queer person. And I also give them a full list of questions, very detailed questions that I'm going to ask. So there's no gotcha moments. And also, after I do an initial editing of the interview, I give it to them to listen to and approve before it's released to the public. So I do a lot of things along the way in producing a Fruitbowl episode that I think makes people more comfortable to share and to feel like their story is going to finally be told. And it's very powerful.
Yeah, nice. You sort of talked about my next question, but do you find that people who may be reticent about certain topics or questions, they eventually open up once they get into it and get a rapport going with you?
You know, because I do give them the list of questions, I have found that people have very defined boundaries about what they will and won't talk about. And I don't push, you know, and I might ask a follow-up or gently, you know, encourage them to elaborate. And if they push back, then I just move on to the next question, because, like, it really doesn't make sense to try to push people too hard, because they're only just gonna probably edit it out when I give it to them for their review. So, you know, this is a situation where, like, I did learn so much from Jeffrey and in being sensitive to the interviewee and knowing to just listen when they're speaking and not interrupt. One really fascinating thing that does happen that has always catches me by surprise is that, you know, I give them the list of questions. They know the order of which I'm going to ask them. But inevitably, what happens at the beginning of each episode or each interview is people will just start to talk. And I call this the dump, which is like an information dump. I should probably find a better name for it. But what I've discovered is like people will just start talking once I start the interview and the camera is first on, and they just keep going. They just keep going, and I just wait until they've gotten it all out. And what I find is that that's often the most valuable part of the interview, and it's the part that people most want to talk about. It's something that maybe they've never had a chance to really say on their own behalf, or maybe they've had some conflict with their family. Maybe they had a hookup that really went wrong, you know, or maybe they had something that they've always wanted to share about a hookup that was the most exciting moment of their life, you know. I just think it's really interesting how the camera provides this permission for people to really feel heard and to finally say what they've always wanted to say. I love that part of the whole process, and it's so satisfying to eventually get to produce that moment and present it to the public. You know, it's very powerful.
Dave, how do you normally find your subjects?
Well, now that I've been doing it for a while, I do have people write me via my website, fruitbowlpodcast.com, and people volunteer that way. And then people who I've already interviewed often will refer other people to me, you know, and that's super useful if they are sort of like, you know, endorsing me in a way in the whole process. And then I do ask my friends a lot, people that I know who I've always been friends with and that I'm curious about their story. So it's a mixed bag, but the thing is, like, I'm not quite as productive with interviewing people because I do prefer to be in the room with them in their homes. So a lot of opportunities that I have may never come to pass because I might not be able to get to Canada or Germany. I've had people from as far away as that volunteer. I've actually really wanted to come to Atlanta because I have very few people representing the South in the more. I have a lot of Texans, but they don't count. I need Southerners, and I know that being queer in the South is a very unique experience, and I would love to gather more of those stories, and I would love to make a trip to Atlanta.
Do that.
Just to do that. Usually, you know, before I plan a trip, I want to have at least 3 interviews in my pocket and planned and scheduled, and people have definitely said yes. So yeah, I mean, if anyone watching this is interested, I would love to hear from Southerners or anyone else, really.
Sure, Dave. I'm always intrigued hearing people talk about sex because, I mean, let's just say I grew up in the dinosaur ages. I grew up, you know, back in the 70s and 80s, and you know, sex and hookup culture was so completely different than the way it is now. But I mean, can you talk about? I'm assuming that you have people who were young and are well versed in Grindr and hookup versus people who, like me, didn't know how to hook up or find other people. Do you have a cross section of people?
Yes, and that is like such a fascinating subject because of the internet, because of smartphones. I have people I've interviewed who used to cruise the Midtown 42nd Street area in New York City. You know, in Stephen and James, the short film, he describes cruising, you know, bathhouse in the early 90s. And yeah, the internet is like a dividing line. And there's before that and after that. It completely changed the game when it comes to you know, hooking up and finding partners, you know, or just having sex. And it's kind of interesting that I'm doing this project too, because like I grew up in the 70s and I cruised, you know, when I was coming out and coming of age, and now I'm, you know, on the apps as well as everyone else. So it's kind of interesting that I've spanned both sides of that. So I think I'm kind of well positioned to make this project just for that reason.
Do you have a favorite story, or maybe a most unexpected story that someone has told you?
There's so many.
I can imagine.
I mean, so many great stories. There's a guy, Mike, from season 3, who traveled to Canada once and ended up hooking up with a guy, and he was using sex toys while they were having sex, and he got a dildo lost up his ass.
Hello to all the family audiences out there. Hello.
Sorry. As I was saying that, I was like, oh, I wonder what kind of audiences this is for. Do you want me to give you a more PG one?
Hey, you've already gone there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's an extreme story, but Mike does such a good job telling it. You can tell that he really, like, probably even wrote it out and rehearsed it, because it's like he just keeps telling it and you're just like, oh my God.
So funny.
Yeah.
That is so funny. So the eventual goal is to make a documentary about this, or maybe have this, on a streaming service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's great.
So that's the dream. But, honestly, like, if all I ever did was make the podcast, I would be fine with that. And, podcasting is really just become such an industry now.
Yeah.
It is a little difficult to get traction, because the market, the world of podcasts right now is so super saturated, especially, I think, because of the pandemic. I think it's something that people really turn to as maybe even a hobby, and it's super easy to start a podcast. So there is a lot of, it's difficult getting traction with an audience, but the people who do tune in and become, regular listeners, I think they really value it as not only for entertainment, but as a resource, and also a way to feel less alone. I feel like so much of the time we experience sex with our partners, but we don't really talk about it in a real way with our friends, except for maybe, a funny hookup story now and then. So I love, like, providing a resource and a platform for queer people to really go there and honestly share, what it's like, and what some of the challenges have been, and also what some of the great times have been.
Exactly.
It's a very rich subject.
Exactly. So tell us where people can find more about Fruitbowl, or where they can watch episodes.
Yeah, I mean, you can visit fruitbowlpodcast.com, and there are links to all the major platforms there, but it's pretty much on any app, like podcast app, that searches the databases, that, it's on all of them. And you can also, if people are interested in supporting the project, I also have a Patreon, and the links to that are on the website as well. And yeah, it's pretty easy to find. Just look for Fruitbowl.
Okay, great. Filmmaker and podcast creator Dave Quantic, thanks so much for joining us. I myself am looking forward to reading more about Fruitbowl and seeing more of the episodes that I have not seen. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to what you're working on next.
Thank you, Jim.
Talk to you soon. Thanks, Dave.